shall not be infringed. Despite what supporters of the monster state want you to believe, shall not be infringed means exactly what it says. Yet today, we have another example among many, proving that words on paper simply can't enforce themselves. Relying on government to follow the rules given to it is a really bad strategy. And this one is the latest annual report from the ATF, an organization that shouldn't even exist, well, at least under the government. It reveals that federal gun control enforcement levels are once again close to record levels. We're looking at the second or third worst in history. And even though they want you to believe that all the things that they're doing are for your safety, almost all of their top enforcement actions are actually for paperwork violations. So on this episode, I've got all the dirty details, plus the receipts. But first of all, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, August 5th, 2024. Again, thank you for being here. Hope you had an awesome weekend. But let's kick this off first with some important principles from the founding generation. And here, St. George Tucker, in his view of the Constitution of the United States, pointed out that this may be considered as the true palladium of liberty. The right of self-defense is the first law of nature. The right of self-preservation. This is the natural rights. You get these by a birthright. You don't have the right of self-defense because you have a permission slip from government. Tucker continues, and he said, in most governments, it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest limits possible. And of course, we see this happen all the time. They're trying to define how things can apply, what the meaning of this or that is, and then try to force it on all the 50 states through, well, the incorporation doctrine, but that's another episode. He continued, wherever standing armies are kept up, and the right of the people to keep and bear arms is, under any color or pretext whatsoever, prohibited, liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction. And if we're not already there, we are really, really close. And that brings me to the latest, well, this is the 2023 annual report. Sometimes they release the data earlier in the year, but I guess like government, you can't rely on them to do anything consistently except violate your rights. And they just released the data at the end of July. And here from Mike Perry's report that we published last week, he said, for the third straight year, the administration's federal gun control enforcement efforts hit close to record levels in 2023. No one should be surprised about that. The pace has slowed modestly in some areas, but the administration continues an aggressive enforcement policy. And there were a few areas where the numbers have gone down just moderately. I'm going to cover all these categories. Cases initiated by the ATF. So they started less cases than they did last year. But as Mike writes, unfortunately, federal prosecutors were more efficient. This doesn't happen too often in government, but they initiated less cases, but they had a higher percentage of initiated cases recommended for prosecution. That went up to 32% compared to 29% in 2022. And the result is that the current administration could easily claim to be the third worst in history when it comes to enforcing federal gun control, if not the second worst in history. And this leads to a key point. Of course, if we believe in the Constitution of the Founders, that the number 0 is incredibly important because that's the number of federal gun control measures, laws, rules, regulations, orders, whatever, that are authorized under the Constitution. That's all of them, past, present, and future, without exception. Of course, that includes the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 68, its amendments in 86, the Undetectable Firearms Act in 1988, and everything that they try to throw at us in the future and everything that they've done since. There's more than that. And even though what I'm talking about today are the actions by the federal government to enforce federal gun control measure, it's important to point out that state and local violations of your natural right of self-defense also violate your natural rights. Of course, this is how Mercy Otis Warren put it. Self-defense is a primary law of nature, which no subsequent law of society can abolish. But let's get back to these, well, bad numbers. And here from Harry's report, the 9,964 cases recommended for prosecution in 2023 You know how many too many that is? 9,964. If they subtracted that, they'd be doing well. They were generally on par with the record level numbers of the last 5 years. And if you're looking here up on the screen, of course, this will be linked to in the show notes. So you can look at all the details, and you can find the link directly to the ATF as well, so you can go to their source on what they're doing. So they're on pace with record level numbers from the last 5 years, except there was a fall off, a drop off during 2020 during all the shutdowns. But it is still well above the average of 9,400-ish cases recommended for prosecution over the last 9 years. So over the last 9-10 years, these are all record numbers, and they just keep getting worse. It's kind of a little up and down. But here's the number of indicted cases. In all, they indicted 9,717 individual defendants in 2023. This is on par. This was a 4% increase over last year and in line with the record level average over the last several years. So this is really not good news. And, we can say that the number of indicted cases, as we see here, let me take a look. There were indictments in 6,592 cases last year compared to 6,300 in 2022. And this is, again, on par with being one of the worst three in history. The record was in 2019. The number 2 was in 2018. And the third worst in history was 2021. So we're right around that level once again. Now, discussing James Madison, let's go to him a little bit here as well, discussing how the American system in Federalist 46 was supposed to be different than the European model, which is a total centralized control. Madison pointed out that tyrannical governments, of course, are afraid to trust the people with arms. That is how it has always been. Governments do not like a population that can defend itself, that can stand up for itself. And that's why they keep these record level of enforcement actions. And of course, I'll get to a little bit later in the show here, they're mostly for paperwork violations. So they're just using that as an attack mechanism to restrict and limit our natural right of self-defense. Now, on convictions, this is not good. Federal prosecutors also achieved a higher conviction rate in 2023. In 2022, the federal government got convictions in about 5,300 some odd cases. That rose to almost 5,900 cases despite fewer cases prosecuted. So even though they dropped off a significant or at least a moderate amount of cases recommended for prosecution, they still got more convictions, which is not a positive turn of events. Of course, Noah Webster pointed out in 1787 that before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed. And that is exactly what's happening here. We see it playing out before our very eyes. It has been happening for decades. And of course, we know that encroachments upon the Constitution, they grow faster every day, as John Adams put it back when he was one of the good guys in 1775, like a cancer. They eat at us faster and faster every hour. It is like a deadly disease. So when a lot of people thought back in 1934 that, okay, well, we're just going to get these criminal gangs because of prohibition who were really arming up. And then so because of government control, people, it led to all kinds of problems. And then they had a solution, which is restrict the right to keep and bear arms. And once you open that door, it will always expand. As St. George Tucker also put it in his view of the Constitution of the United States, that all governments, not some, but all governments have a tendency to increase in size, scope, and power. So the record number of convictions came in 2019 and then 2017. So the worst number of convictions were a few years ago under the last administration, but 2021 and 2023 have been right up there near the top, positioning them to be the second worst in history. In total, Mike Meharry reports, federal prosecutors convicted 7,917 defendants in cases brought by the ATF. Now, again, we're talking about some 30,000 recommended for prosecution. They had a pretty decent success rate, well, fail rate in being able to prosecute people. I guess it depends on your perspective, glass half full or half empty. I want, every single one of these individuals, 7,917, there is no authorization for any federal gun control measure. So all of these convictions are unconstitutional in my mind. Now, that doesn't mean that they did not get some bad guys, But let's address that in a little bit as well. So we're looking at the second worst in history currently that we're living under right now, with 7,917 defendants convicted by the federal government for, well, federal gun control measures. All this stuff is going to be linked to in the show notes, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. You're going to be able to read Mike Meharry's report, the data, the fact sheet from the ATF going through all their statistics, plus the original source documents of the leading founders that I'm citing here, whether it's James Madison, Noah Webster, St. George Tucker, and others, Mercy Otis Warren. Alan Mosley will get that organized over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, and I'll get it published a couple of hours after this live stream is done. Of course, you'll also find not just the show notes section where you have all the different platforms, all the different links that we have, but we also have all the different platforms we put the show on, whether it's live streaming on the mainstream ones like Facebook and YouTube and X and LinkedIn and Twitch. We also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com and have the audio-only podcast edition everywhere that we're able to do so now. But if we're missing from something that you think we should be on, please do let us know, whether it's through a comment or an email, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Now, while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment. This is a little faster episode than we normally do on Monday, but I wanted to get this information out to you guys. I want to take a quick moment to say hello to everyone out in the chat. I appreciate you being here, whether it's live or in the archive. There's Brewster and Gypsy and Dennis and a few others over on Rumble. Over on YouTube and Facebook, Dave and Howard, Senator DT, Rights Are Not Tradition, Diana, good to see you, and Haji and a number of other people as well. Again, I appreciate you being here, but let's get right back to this information as soon as I can pull up my notes here. Now, of course, a lot of people, and I keep mentioning that they'll tell us this is for our safety. Oh, okay, well, maybe the ATF is just going for the worst guy. Now, we hear that more so when a different team is in power, like under the last administration. We would hear excuses, even though we pointed out that these are record numbers of gun control enforcement actions by the administration. They would say, oh, well, they're probably just going after the bad guys. They're just going after violent murders. And of course, they also prosecute other issues at the ATF. And that's setting aside, not even willing to accept that there might be a different problem. Now, that means they claim that most of these enforcement actions are just going after violent criminals, and so they're just keeping us safe. But John Dickinson and so many of the other leading founders and old revolutionaries warned us against trusty government to keep us safe. Here's Dickinson putting it in a very diplomatic way in his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767. The money said to be taken from us for our defense may be employed to our injury. And that brings me to the types of cases that the ATF has been prosecuting, convicting people on, throwing people in cages, fining them, etc. And Meharry's report points out that the ATF also investigates arson, cases involving explosives, and alcohol and tobacco cases. But these make up a small percentage of the total. So last year was over 90% of all cases were related to firearms. The previous administration, 92% of them were related to firearms. And before that, the administration prior to that, 90% are related to firearms. So alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosive, BATFE, even though it should be a corner store rather than a government agency, almost all of it, almost everything that they do, 90 to 92% of what they do is try to convict people on firearms violations. Now, that's not a firearms violation, as we'll see here in just a moment, because there's much more. It's not just about firearms violations like someone hurting another person, like there's a victim there. And then, of course, we would be more sympathetic to that. I wouldn't be sympathetic to violating the Constitution even if it was for a good cause, because once you open the door for them to do that, as Thomas Jefferson warned in 1791, you give them a boundless field of power. They have no line in the sand. As long as they can give you a good reason for an emergency or whatever to go beyond the limits, then they're always going to have another reason to torture into twisting the Constitution or ignoring the rules. So even though we could be sympathetic, we'd oppose their actions, but at least there'd be some sympathy. But as we can see from this ATF chart that's up here on the screen, it will also be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. It's even worse than that. with issues regarding Form 4473 being cited as 5 of the top 10 most frequently cited violations. So, for example, number 3, failure to obtain a completed Form 4473 is 21,000 times. Number 5, failure to record NICS contact information on Form 4473. So you could just see this over and over and over. And actually, all of the top 10 were actually paperwork violations. None of the top 10 are getting violent criminals. They're just claiming if you don't fill out the paperwork, then we're going to prosecute you because you might be letting violent criminals do such and such. But this is just absurdity. So here, for example, the number 1 was failure to maintain an accurate, complete, timely acquisition and disposition record of firearms. So keeping track of who's doing what. Of course, they want to tell us they don't have a registry. We know Gun Owners of America has been sounding the alarm on this for a number of years, that there really is a de facto registry out there that they're not authorized to have. And I do like taking it to the base level as well, that they're not authorized to do any of this in the first place. The ATF, the only thing it's authorized to do under the Constitution is disband. So all of the top 10 last year were paperwork violations. They're not protecting us from violent criminals. They're just convicting as many people as possible because governments are afraid to trust the people with arms, especially tyrannical ones. And we live under the largest government in the history of the planet. If that's not some form of despotism, I don't know what is. Now, it was the same kind of situation, this paperwork situation, during the last administration when we were reporting on all these issues relating to federal gun control. These people are terrible. This is the worst in history. The dude bragged about it in 2019 in August. Like, we would just hear, oh, they're probably getting rapists and murderers, etc., etc., etc. But this is absolute garbage as well. We also have the top 10 because the ATF just tells us. Not that we trust them, but this is a type of reporting. They would want to brag about how they're protecting us other than just getting people for paperwork violations. So in 2019, that was the record-breaking year for federal gun control enforcement. And only 1 in the top 10 in that year was not technically a paperwork violation. It's number 9, failure to complete a NICS POC background check. Otherwise, all of them. Number 1, failure to obtain a completed 4473. Number 4, failure to record NICS contact information on 4473. 5, failure by transfer to sign and or date Form 4473. I mean, just missing a signature or a date, and they're prosecuting people. And Mike Meharry, this is actually a different report. What all these so-called violations, I think it's from TJ, what all these so-called violations have in common is that there was absolutely no victim. So the previous administration, the NRA-endorsed head dude, has put more non-violent people in prison for gun charges than his predecessor. And this should be absolutely shocking. And it should be a call to arms for people who support the right to keep and bear arms. And I think that also is yet another example, like I said at the outset, proving Roger Sherman right, and so many other founders, like I mentioned in an episode just last week, that words on paper can't enforce themselves. The founding generation told us over and over and over that relying on what they called a parchment barrier to enforce itself was going to lead to really bad results. Here's Roger Sherman writing as a countryman in November of 1787. He said, "No Bill of Rights ever yet bound the supreme power longer than the honeymoon of a new married couple, unless the rulers were interested in preserving the rights." So, proven absolutely correct. No Bill of Rights ever bound the supreme power longer than the honeymoon of a new couple. And maybe the honeymoon of a new couple lasted from 1789 through, or 1791, we would say, until 1934. That's a pretty good honeymoon. But since then, it has been all downhill. No matter what anyone wants to tell you, it has been all bad because, again, once they go beyond those limits, they will always add more and more and more. And I know even though the Supreme Court held against the bump stock ban of 2018, that proves that it doesn't matter which team is doing it because you have the record enforcement levels plus new gun control efforts by executive fiat that happened in the last administration. The current administration tries to do the same kind of thing, nipping at his tails third worst in history, second worst in history, depending on which category and how you count the numbers. None of this stuff is good. And Roger Sherman was absolutely correct that you can't rely on the Bill of Rights to enforce itself. And going to the federal government, one part of the federal government, to try to get that part of the federal government to tell another part of the federal government to stop doing what the federal government was never supposed to do in the first place is also proving to be a really bad strategy for protecting the Constitution and liberty. And Mike Maharrey puts it like this. In fact, if the government followed the Constitution, the ATF wouldn't exist at all. All federal gun control laws are unconstitutional. Under the Constitution, there is nothing for the ATF to enforce. There is no asterisk after shall not be infringed. As I said at the outset, shall not be infringed means exactly what it says. Shall not be infringed. And Mike says no terms and conditions apply. And the bottom line, of course, is we can't trust either team, left or right, blue or red, in Washington, D.C., to uphold the Second Amendment. It's not even close. Now, that's the bad news. There is some good news, and here's how St. George Tucker put it. Now, it's not going to be easy to turn things around, but it can be turned around, and this is how he put it. The acquiescence of the people of a state under any usurped authority for any length of time can never deprive them of the right of resuming the sovereign power into their own hands whenever they think fit or are able to do so, since that right is perfectly unalienable. So in other words, whenever the people wise up and decide to take a stand for their liberty, to exercise their rights, whether they get permission from government or not, they do have the ability to turn this around. They have the power and the right to do it, but it's not going to be easy. And Thomas Paine, of course, in The American Crisis, I think it was number 4, he said, those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigues of supporting it. But ultimately, as Thomas Jefferson put it, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. And that's why we believe it's so essential to get this kind of information out to more and more people. And nothing helps us do this work every single day more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they keep depreciating, and they're using that as a tool to oppress us by empowering and funding the largest government in history, and then also making it more difficult for us to get by on a day-to-day basis. So I understand if it's difficult for you to be able to chip in, but if you got a couple of bucks, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options available. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment and say a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us as members lately. There's Gerald in Michigan, Elaine in California, James in Florida, Leslie in Texas, Kimberly in Illinois, Douglas in Tennessee, and also Sam in Illinois. I'm so grateful for your support. Again, if you'd like to join in with them, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I see a lot of interesting conversation going back and forth with Diana and Howard and Wrights and Kirk and a few others. I'll take a look through that a little bit later today or tomorrow. I get a chance to read through almost everything, but I don't have a lot of time to be able to reply to everything. You can also email me your suggestions or feedback over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And if you want to help us spread the word, free and easy peasy. You can also smash the like button, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments in the archive, sharing links, getting notifications. All those things can trigger the algorithms, especially of these mainstream platforms, and tell them to show us to more people. Again, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you had a great weekend. Hope your Monday's off to a good start. And I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on the path to liberty.